More and more high-speed broadband internet service is being seen as a necessity rather than a luxury. In some places, in fact, municipalities are now rolling out their own internet services in competition with commercial carriers. Cities see this as a way that their citizens can more easily compete, but some states see that competition as improper and have passed laws to prevent it, or at least to rein it in. The Federal Communications Commission has come down in favor of the cities, and Congress may decide to act to prevent the FCC from more aggressively protecting the new city internet services. So, states' rights involved here to a certain extent, whether states should have the right to regulate its municipalities without federal government interference. But then again, there's the question of the best service at the best available price, even if that means it's provided by a local government. So, wouldn't that be best for the local economies? We'll be talking about this tonight with Lawrence Spiwak of the Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal and Economic Public Policy Studies. They're online at the website phoenix-center.org. And, by the way, Mr. Spiwak spent 5 years as a senior attorney in the FCC's Office of General Counsel, so you've seen this from all angles. Give us your overview of what's at stake here.
Well, what's at stake, and thank you for having me, Jim.
Sure.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely.
What's at stake here is what the administration is essentially asking the FCC to do, and what they're proposing is illegal, because we've already been down this road. There's a statute called Section 253 of the Communications Act, which gives the Commission authority to preempt state laws, which is a good thing. If you remember, by way of example, years ago when the satellite TV industry was starting, and your condo association wouldn't let you, and states wouldn't let you put up a satellite dish on the outside of your condo. And the FCC used that authority to block. So it's a very important statute. But the question came out where you have these states, as you said. The issue of whether municipal broadband is a good idea is really a state issue. It's left to the state legislature to decide what they should do with the creatures that they create, because the municipality is a creature of the state.
That's something we should keep in mind. Just as the states created the federal government, and there's long been a battle over just exactly how much power the states ceded to the federal government, but that is at least a discussion. In terms of municipalities versus states, there's no question whatsoever. Municipalities are entirely the creation of the state.
Absolutely, and that's an important point as I walk you through a sort of very arcane and complex piece of the law here. So the municipal broadband proponents said, I got a great idea. I live in a state where it has one of these laws that restrict or prohibit municipal broadband, and I want to get this law overturned. I failed in the State House to get this law overturned. But wait, there's this little statute over here, Section 253 of the Communications Act, that says the FCC can preempt state laws dealing with that impede competition in communications. I know this will be great. I'll ask them to grant a preemption of the state laws. And it talks about any entity. And what happened is the FCC looked at this, and this was, by the way, under Clinton Gore. This was a Democrat-controlled FCC. Mm-hmm. They looked at the law and they said, I really would like to grant this petition, but the law is very clear. Any entity does not mean a creature of the state. It means a private corporation. So I'm sorry, I have to deny your petition for preemption. Sorry. That was then appealed all the way up to the United States Supreme Court in a case called Nixon versus Missouri Municipal Utility League.
Mm-hmm. Referring to Governor Jay Nixon, I gather.
That is the same guy when he was Attorney General.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court looked at it, and the Supreme Court said, let's be very clear here. I have to make a legal call. I am not going to get into the merits of whether municipal broadband is a good idea or a bad idea. I'm going to look at the constitutionality of this question. And based on our reading of the Constitution, you cannot, having the FCC preempt a law of a state law which controls a state subdivision is a bridge too far. That's too much. So this FCC was right. You do not have the constitutional authority to use Section 253 to preempt state laws that restrict or prohibit municipal broadband. So we think that's the end of the story. It's a settled law now. The Supreme Court has ruled on it. Enter the new section, Section 706, and this is where it gets very interesting and a little bit complex. So let me walk you through this a little bit. Section 706, like Section 253, was added to the Communications Act in 1996 when they did the last big rewrite.
Yeah.
Section 706 you'll hear a lot of people say it was never intended to be an independent source of authority. Because what it says is the commission is supposed to look to see if broadband is being deployed on a reasonable and timely basis to all Americans. And if it's not being deployed on a reasonable and timely basis, it shall take all actions to make sure that it's being reasonably timely deployed. That came up as a way in 2010 as the FCC's rationale for its net neutrality rules. They said, you know what, I've got independent authority under this as opposed to other sections of the Communications Act, and this is what I'm going to use to regulate the Internet. It's a light touch, and the D.C. Circuit basically agreed under sort of parameters in a case called Verizon v. FCC. And what that case did was it now made Section 706 a full-fledged independent source of regulatory authority for the FCC. And under Section 706, it says the FCC shall either engage in regulation or it shall forbear from regulation. So
what does that mean?
Well, forbearance is very different from preemption. To forbear means one of the things they're talking about in the comments of net neutrality is under Section 203, for example, common carriers have to file a tariff. The FCC, it was a very novel concept that the agents would say, I will now no longer have to adhere to the law. I will forbear from enforcing this section of the statute. So it's a forbearance, but preemption is the constitutional element where I'm now going to take a state law and make it null and void. So it's a very different saying. One is the law that I am bound by. The other, that's forbearance. Preemption is actually taking the state, the federal government, telling the state it cannot enforce one of its laws. So it's a very subtle but very important legal concept.
Okay.
So are we following here? It's a very convoluted.
Yes, it is a bit convoluted.
But it gets better.
Okay.
It gets better. So you have this word forbearance. So now the municipal broadband proponents have all of a sudden, oh my goodness, this is my new legal theory. I can have the FCC forbear from a state law. And Chairman Wheeler has said, and this is even before the president got involved last year, he said, I believe I now have the authority to use it to get rid of these state municipal broadband laws, and I intend to use it, presumably under Section 706.
And this is an administration that never shied away from finding extra federal authority anywhere it can find it.
Yes, absolutely, right on. So this is where we think he's going to go. So here are the multiple legal problems with using this statute, Section 706, to preempt a state law. Number one, the most important thing is, as I just mentioned a moment ago, there is a huge legal difference between the concept of preemption and forbearance. Okay? And we're not going to
get too much into 3 credit hours of law school here.
No.
Okay.
But it's very simple. But preemption, again, is telling a state you can no longer enforce your law. And the FCC's done that very well in earlier circumstances. But this is, again, going against Nixon. The Supreme Court has already said you cannot use the one preemption statute that you have to get rid of state municipal laws. What makes you think you have a statute which doesn't even use the word preemption? The Supreme Court is very adamant that if Congress is going to grant an agency preemption authority, it has to be really clear, and it's not in this particular statute.
Is this whole big argument all revolving around the constitutional power of the federal government to regulate interstate commerce?
That and the 10th Amendment. Yeah, but that's what the Supreme Court said. You can't go that far. And there is preemption. Congress can pass a law giving an agency some preemption authority, but it's got to be very clear, and there's got to be a very clear, the authority's got to be clear, and the federal purpose has got to be clear. So, but that's not in the statute that the FCC wants to use.
And presumably, this new Congress would be unlikely to give the FCC the kind of statute that they would like to use.
Yes. It was interesting.
So it's 706 or nothing.
Exactly. Now, they tried it, I think, in like 2005, a little bit, some sort of a compromise, and it didn't go anywhere. But I don't think once you get into the merits of essentially having the private sector compete against the government, which is exactly what this is. I mean, if you take the totality of the circumstances of what this administration is trying to do, between net neutrality, between promoting municipal broadband, the broadband industry in this country is under attack by this administration. And that's really sort of the big political story here, because they are doing what they can to reduce profitability, to make network deployment uneconomic, and to crowd out private investment by promoting public investment.
Unless the state is operating these carriers, the government service, at a loss, I don't know how I've ever heard the public sector operating anything cheaper than the private sector. Exactly how are they able to do that in the first place, given the usual waste and incompetence? Well, incompetence is perhaps carrying it a little far, but waste that is often built into the governmental process. How can they be cheaper in the first place unless they're subsidizing it?
Funny you should mention that, Jim, because that is exactly correct. That is exactly correct. I mean, labor costs are labor costs, whether it's private sector or you got to go out and hire a truck. But last year, it's interesting because a lot of people hold out municipal broadband. Oh, it's cheaper than the private sector. It's cheaper, and they hold out a bunch of examples. Well, last year we did a study and actually found that all of these arguments were completely bogus, because when they were selectively picking this product and that product, they weren't comparing apples to apples. Well, guess what? When you compare like services to like services of what these municipal broadband networks are providing versus what the private sector is providing, guess what? They're actually higher than what the private sector prices are.
I'm shocked, absolutely shocked. So in other words, this is a certain amount of rhetorical flim-flammery akin to the notion of free community college. Unless, in fact, the faculty works for free and the administration works for free and the janitors sweep for free and the contractors built the college for free, it ain't free. No, you're talking about a community college in which somebody else is paying for that attendance.
And let me just give you some numbers.
All right.
I'll give you some examples. You've hit it absolutely right on the head. One of I would call the poster child for municipal broadband, which is the city of Chattanooga project, which is what the FCC is going to use as its test case to use this bogus Section 706 preemption authority in February. Okay? Let's be very clear. They got, and you can, this is actually a paper we're going to be releasing next week. They got $229 million in revenue bonds that are subsidized by the captive ratepayers of the electric utility portion of the Chattanooga utility. The captive ratepayers. This is not a greenfield build where I'm just going to build fiber. This comes out of the Chattanooga municipal electric system, so they've got captive ratepayers who are paying for this. Okay. On top of that, the electric side loaned the broadband side $50 million. Right. And there's more. Okay. Then they got a $111 million grant from the United States Department of Energy for smart grid, which is also going to pay for this fiber network, when you can do smart grid essentially on dial-up. And guess what, that 111, that's me and you.
Right. Federal taxpayers, neither one of whom lives in Chattanooga.
Exactly.
We are subsidizing broadband service in Chattanooga.
Absolutely. And let me put it in perspective for you. When you run the numbers for what that works out per subscriber in Chattanooga, it works out to be about $2,000 per subscriber subsidy. Now, to put it in perspective, let's say we gave to the number of customers Comcast had or AT&T had. You're talking about giving to the private sector. I just know this because they're the largest broadband service providers. If you gave each one of their customers a $2,000 subsidy, given they have more customers, you're talking $30 to $35 billion. A gift, not a loan, a gift. So that's the huge amount of the subsidy we're talking about here.
So this is simply the latest manifestation of wealth redistribution.
Yeah, it is absolutely a dog and pony show.
Right. More to come. We'll be back in a moment. We talk with Lawrence Spiwak of the Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal and Economic Public Policy Studies, and that comes down as phoenix-center.org. So all of these subsidies come pouring in from captive users of electricity.
Captive ratepayers.
Captive ratepayers, and of course the federal subsidies, outright money taken that you and I have given to, in the case that we've been looking at, Chattanooga, Tennessee. But, of course, it's all worked out wonderfully, and all of these municipal broadband systems are just functioning just wonderfully. True?
No.
Not true. Okay, so despite all of that, it's not, then with all this help, why not?
Well, there's been being in the broadband business is a really hard business. It's expensive, because not only do you have to build the network, not only do you have to maintain the network, but you've got to sell the network. So it's a very, very difficult business. It's very intensive. We're not talking about building Starbucks. This is a very expensive business. And a lot of municipalities have found that this sort of broadband everywhere kind of thing based on the taxpayer dollars has been a total financial disaster. I'll give you just a couple examples.
Okay.
You have Groton, Connecticut, which was another electric utility. Bust. Companies taxpayers are paying a fortune. It cost them years to get out. As I was having dinner tonight before the show, I was reading about a municipal network in Leverett, Massachusetts. Another 20 years it's going to cost people to get out. Utopia, which was a Utah-based municipal network, went bust. Private company bought it. They're now, because to pay for everything, every single taxpayer is going to pay a $20 a month fee to pay it back for the next 20 years, even if they never take the broadband service.
How are they taking to that? Or
I don't live in Utah, but I can imagine not well. But it was such a boondoggle of what they paid. In fact, I ran into a state legislator from Utah a couple of years ago, and he goes, "Have you heard of our project?" I said, "Yes." He goes, "What should I do?" I said, "Sell." But this is the problem. It's expensive to be broadband, and a lot of times these guys are coming in as the third entrant, trying to overbuild private sector investment. So there's no guarantee of success here. We have a joke in telecom that building a broadband network is not field of dreams. If you build it, they will not come. It's an expensive business. You build out to meet your demand like any other business. Doing these giant greenfield builds of broadband to the hamlet just makes no economic sense at all. And the crowding out of private investment is a big deal. I mean, I guess it was 2010, the FCC did its famous national broadband report. And they did a couple papers with the initial report. And they found, ubiquitous broadband, if you can build fiber everywhere, it would cost the 20% of most expensive homes, we did the numbers, about $50,000 a home. I mean, to subsidize that, surely we must have other better things to do with that kind of money.
One would think so.
One would think so.
All right, stand by. We'll come back with more. Again, Lawrence Spiwak is with the Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal and Economic Public Policy Studies. And if you haven't kept up on the broadband battle, here it is, your money and their service. Back in a moment. Our guest is Lawrence Spiwak. He's president of the Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal and Economic Public Policy Studies. It's a nonprofit that studies broad public policy issues related to governance and social and economic conditions. It emphasizes law and economics of the digital age. Mr. Spiwak spent 5 years as a senior attorney in the FCC's Office of General Counsel. So, let's look at the philosophical underpinning of this all. First of all, what you may know, I don't happen to know, what's the typical cost of monthly private sector service of broadband internet?
The average triple pay price is about $100.
Okay, so about $1,200 a year.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now then, what has been the cost, as far as we can tell, to those paying the subsidies of a municipally provided broadband internet service? Do we know? Presumably more than that, I guess.
Well, again, we did a study. You can get it off our webpage. A group here in town called the New America Foundation does an annual report.
In Washington, D.C.
In Washington, D.C., right. And they said, municipal broadband is so much cheaper. And they looked at 3 municipalities. So that's what we looked at. One was Lafayette, Louisiana. One was Chattanooga. And the other one was Bristol, Virginia.
Okay.
And they had done a study. Said, look, it's so much cheaper. But the problem is they weren't comparing it to like bundles of the private sector. And again, you can look at the study. Was from last January. And it was entitled, in fact, I have it right here in front of me. It's called, you can get it off our webpage.
Yeah, well, while you're looking for it, I can tell you right now that I can guarantee you that a publicly subsidized Yugo is going to cost less than a privately provided Rolls Royce.
But it wasn't. It ends up their service offering was actually higher when you combine like services. The title of our paper was written by our very brilliant chief economist, Dr. George Ford. And called Do Municipal Networks Offer More Attractive Service Offerings than Private Sector Providers? A Review and Expansion of the Evidence. And we go through a very, very detailed analysis about what it is. So it's not the actual price that's it's the network build-out cost. If you can imagine what it costs to go build a network, you need to lay fiber. You got to hire guys to dig the trenches. You've got to get the billing machines, to put the invoices in the envelope. All these things go to customer service, customer retention. I mean, for the cost of building a network, it's really for $1 of network costs, it could be upwards of $3 to $5 of non-network costs. So it's these subsidies that allow these build-outs to come, to overbuild. And the problem is that, when you're in telecom, you're always building to the top of the technology curve at the time, but over time, obviously, today's technology becomes outdated. So you're building to the top, but you're building these super fiber networks because it's easy. I mean, if you're going to dig a trench in the ground, you're not going to lay old copper. You're going to put down the top fiber down there.
Yes.
But what you're doing is, if you're the private sector, it's more than just actually even the subsidies. You're competing at City Hall. So if I'm in the private sector and I want to go lay fiber down, I've got to get rights of way, I've got to get a franchise, and the cities are notorious about holding you up about this. Notorious. They shake you down. Oh, I want to get some public access channels on my cable, whatever it is, pay extra this. It's a huge industry of how the cities shake down private broadband providers.
If the public is paying for it, then it's Cadillac service all the way. There's nothing that the public shouldn't be asked to pay for.
Yeah, well, but the joke is, they don't have to deal with getting a franchise because it's the city themselves. But if I'm a private sector, I've got to fight City Hall to get permits. So it's already a one-up thing, so it's cheaper for them in a way to deploy because they don't have to pay any regulatory compliance costs because they're the regulator.
So now we come down to the basic philosophical question, or the premise. And let me see if I am phrasing this as the advocates would phrase it. But I believe my understanding of this now would be as follows. Broadband Internet service is so important to existence in the 21st century that it has become, in effect, a basic right, and therefore must be subsidized for even the neediest. Have I roughly summarized what it is they're saying?
You must do this professionally. That was an excellent summary.
All right. There are some things. I'll put it this way. I will concede that there are something. I am not in favor of something that friends of mine, when I was in the Army, friends of mine saw when they were stationed in Ethiopia. They had a special squad in this particular part of Ethiopia, in which it was a group of people, and they went around every morning with a truck, and they would pick up all the people off the streets who had died the night before on the streets of this particular town. Sometimes starvation, sometimes this or that disease, often stuff that we haven't seen in the West in decades. I am not in favor of a society like that. I do believe that there should be public subsidies provided to maintain a basic level of physical health, to provide enough nutrition for those who are genuinely incapable of feeding themselves, and so on and so forth. Have we, in fact, in your view, legitimately elevated broadband Internet service on a par with that kind of public need?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, it's a wonderful thing. The Internet's wonderful. I mean, we've done studies. In fact, my partner just published a paper in one of the highest-ranked epidemiological journals talking about how Internet use, believe it or not, reduces depression in the elderly because they get involved in interaction. So it's a wonderful thing, and it helps get jobs. And we've done studies where it helps get jobs. Fantastic stuff. And before you go any further, let me interject. I would concur that it is wonderful, and I could easily buy into the notion that it would help with that. All Internet service does not, of necessity, automatically have to be broadband. I'm not sure how close. That is absolutely correct. How close are we to the time when anything less than that will be virtually steam powered? In other words, to have Internet service at all, it'll almost have to be broadband. Well, there's broadband all over the place. I mean, that's not actually the fight. That's the sort of how the municipal broadband side, I think, twists it. I mean, I think 98% of Americans have access to broadband. But the question is then how fast? Well, I want 100 gigabits. I don't use 100 gigabits. How good is enough to get you to what you have to use? Exactly. Now, and that's the point here. If, for example, we were talking about, let's say, the kind of access necessary for the children of a poor family to keep up in school, now you're reaching into
a persuadable part of my psyche. I'm listening. Okay, the kids have to have this level, X level of broadband service, or they can't keep up with their homework assignments, which increasingly are digital.
Absolutely.
I'm with you. Right. Now, the kind of access you just talked about, 100 gigabytes? What are you talking
these
about?
Gig networks, exactly.
I'm not sure. What files are that broad? Are we talking here about what? Constantly watching movies or something? I don't even know what is out there. Is there a video game that demands that kind of access? I don't even know what it would be.
Exactly the point. And I think what a lot of people don't understand about the broadband debate, as I said earlier, if you build it, they will not come. So part of the broadband discussion is not broadband deployment, but broadband adoption. In this country, particularly, and really because we were some of the first people who identified this this need, where, if you have a kid in school, you're more likely to have broadband. That over the last 5 years, this country has spent an inordinate amount, I think a correct allocation of resources, to try and get people interested in broadband, because a lot of people, they don't use it, they don't know how to do it. Old people tend not to have internet adoption, while younger people do. To give a plug, for example, for Comcast Internet Essentials, there is a program, a private sector program, $10 a month for the kids. If you're on the school lunch program, you get adequate. You get a computer. It's a fantastic program, and that has done far more than all the $7.2 billion we spent as part of the Recovery Act. Got more people online than the government programs with the private sector, because it was tailored. It was much more efficient. So there are a tremendous amount of programs of people doing. Because don't forget, if you're a broadband service provider, an empty network makes you no money. Okay, we used to say the joke, how much does a network cost? Your first minute, $50 billion. Your second minute, free, right? Because it's like a hotel. It's like, it doesn't, unless you got traffic on it, doesn't make you any money.
Let's pause and come back, because I have a follow-up question to that. At 1-866-50-JIMBO, you're welcome to throw in yours as well, and we'll be back in a moment. Phoenix-center.org, and we're learning about this notion of municipalities providing broadband internet service, and the battle that's going on right now involving the Federal Communications Commission. All right. Assuming that there is a compelling need, which you have, frankly, fairly well destroyed, I think, in very reasoned discussion, the notion that there is this overwhelming compelling need. But let's assume that there is the need for some people to have a certain level of internet service which they cannot afford, which is apparently a small number of people. You can tell us more about the quantity. But if, in fact, that is the case, why set up the infrastructure of an entire municipal broadband internet service? Why not simply target these individuals if you make the case that they need the subsidies, and give them the subsidies, and they can get a private sector internet service? If that's what my guess would be, that if you're that poor that you can't afford this $100 a month average, there are probably other things that you need before you need broadband internet. But for the sake of argument, if in fact it is determined by society through their elected representatives that the need exists, why not just vouchers to go to your local internet provider?
Well, we have that. We have a whole $8 billion a year universal service program.
Then what's the problem?
There you go. Because local politicians say, look, I've got a gigabit network in my thing. And here's an interesting thing, and maybe I mentioned earlier, but I think it bears repeating. They hold these things. The main reason why people hold up municipal broadband is sort of two reasons. One, they say, well, it's competition. It's like, first off, you're not competing. You're the government. So get competition. If anything, it's community development. So, all right, it's community development. If that's the case, well, we're bringing jobs here. Okay, so, again, that goes to my point. You and I, sitting here in Washington, D.C., are subsidizing, let's say, Function Junction, Iowa's municipal broadband. Mm-hmm. If I move there, you're not doing economic development. You're doing business stealing. And there's a big difference between economic migration and economic development. And that's what this is all about.
Is this a power grab? Just, in other words, some municipalities just like the idea that, hey, we don't only have electricity and water and sewer. we've got broadband. I mean, is it something as childish as that?
I don't think it's as childish. I mean, I think people genuinely believe it's. I kind of more. It's like Andy Rooney and Judy Garland. Like, come on, kids, we're going to put on a show. Let's build a broadband network.
Yeah, but it takes more than my dad's barn to do a broadband network.
Well, but if we can get everybody to tax and pay for it, it's going to be a great show. And that's kind of where it's at. It's like, it's a wonderful thing.
All right. Any other parts of the argument up to this point that I have missed?
No, I think you pretty much hit it. I mean, hopefully I've painted a good picture for you of sort of where this political dynamic is and why the president has viewed this as just a great political thing to pump in his State of the Union.
And this is going to be a part of the State of the Union?
Oh, yes. Yeah. He went out and made a speech in Iowa earlier this week.
He's been giving, in fact, I'm not sure why he's even going to bother to give the speech now. He's given enough individual snippets that he could just send out a dozen podcasts and we'd all know precisely what the State of the Union is.
Yes.
But be that as it may. All right. Then we're going to pause briefly and we'll come back and see the likely outcome given the current breakdown of power, of course, since the public keeps voting the straight paralysis ticket of a Democratic president and a Republican House, and now they've decided to play with it and change the Democratic Senate to a Republican Senate. We'll see just where this all stands, and of course we'll get into the area of those wonderful executive orders when we return with Lawrence Spiwak from Phoenix-Center.org in just a moment. Good to have you with us on the Bohannon Show tonight. We're talking again with Lawrence Spiwak of Phoenix-Center.org, who has been deeply involved in this. I have to wonder if in fact this is such a vital need, why isn't more of our foreign aid along these lines? Why are we not sending to the remote villages of Nigeria and Somalia broadband internet? I mean, they obviously need that more than food, or fighting Ebola or what have you. But in any event, reminded of the fellow who was criticized being wealthy, who was not giving enough money to the poor. And he said, I donate a lot. Actually, last year I gave the ghetto 3 of my favorite polo ponies. So, be that as it may. How does this fit into the net neutrality discussion? It sounds like part and parcel of the same thing.
Yeah. And in fact, in February, the FCC is going to drop 2 major orders. One is this municipal broadband preemption, which they have no legal authority to do. And the second one is they are, after 12, almost 15 years of what, believe it or not, started with the Clinton-Gore administration, is to classify the Internet as a public utility and all that brings with it.
Can they just declare that to be the case? Wouldn't there be major battles? I mean, that would be akin, would it not, to declaring the steel industry a public utility, or declaring the aircraft industry a public utility. I mean, that would be a step toward a legitimately, as defined by the dictionary, socialist country. Well, if you declare a large industry to be a public utility.
Well, the commission has one commission has done, another commission can always undo. And keep in mind, when the Clinton-Gore administration made this decision, when the Internet was in its nascency, nobody knew where to put the round peg. This was all new and novel. They had sort of bits and pieces. And what's interesting, if you go back to the history of telecom back to the 80s, and this is getting really arcane, I'm sure, for your audience, but what's important to know is the FCC has always had a policy of applying a light regulatory touch to new and nascent technologies that would disrupt the status quo. And that's how the long-distance market started. They used to, they kept AT&T regulated and basically put no regulation on Sprint and MCI. They did, what used to be the old VoIP, if you remember, Vonage when that was coming up, light regulatory touch.
Whatever happened to them? You never hear about them anymore.
It's now actually integrating your network. It's become just that amazing and part and parcel and Skype and everything else. So they've always had a light regulatory touch. And they did it with the Internet. They did that on wireless broadband, which has been a tremendous success. I mean, look at what people are paying for the auctions and the growth of wireless because it's been lightly regulated. I mean, I'm not a person who says there shouldn't be no regulation. We want consumer protection. We want to make sure the traffic goes through.
Yes,
but
agreed.
It's, lightly regulated. We're not going to make you file tariffs. We're not going to make you file, literally, the phone companies still to this day have to file data on how much art they own. I'm not making that up. That is true. It's called ARMIS data. This is old legacy regulation. And they said, we don't want to impose this legacy stuff. We don't want to have death by 50 state public utility commissions. We want this nice, clean. And now we're going to reverse this. And the joke is the FCC wasn't going to go down this path. They were going to walk the line and say, because the D.C. Circuit gave us a path where we can protect consumers, have enough legal authority, and because the net roots people and the left who don't even understand what Title II is said Title II must be a good idea, even though Title II allows for what they call paid prioritization and reasonable discrimination. Now we've got to reclassify in a strict political thing. And then the president weighed in about a month ago. And what was startling about his weighing in fact, I did an op-ed for The Hill called The Collectivist in Chief. He didn't even understand the issues. He got them all wrong. This is just naked politics to a certain base of the Democratic Party.
30 seconds to go here. Bottom line, given the current centers of power in this city, do you expect cities to be able to continue to set up their own broadband?
If their states allow them to do that, but I am positive that the FCC's attempt to use its newfound preemption authority will be struck down ultimately if it even goes to the Supreme Court.
Fair enough. All right, stay with us here, and we'll speak a bit off air. Lawrence Spiwak, and again, another example of how, for many of you, you don't have enough. You do have too much money, and you're not doing enough for others, and so the government will arrange for ways to see to it that you do that. Lawrence Spiwak, our guest tonight from phoenix-center.org on the Jim Bohannon Show, and I am Jim Bohannon. This is Westwood One.